When a family reunion with his trophy wife reveals his rusty car is hiding World War II secrets, this suburban dad learns some possessions are worth killing for. The late afternoon sun was already starting its slow, buttery descent behind the suburban oak trees, casting long, theatrical shadows across my driveway. I was fiddling with the latch on the trunk of the '88 Oldsmobile, affectionately nicknamed the Barge by everyone who'd ever seen it, when the sleek, silent whine of a European engine announced the arrival of my son, Mark, and his trophy wife, Chloe. Chloe. Even the sound of her name felt expensive. They pulled up in a matte black Mercedes SUV that looked less like a car and more like a highly armored drone. Mark, ever the dutiful son, leaped out first, offering a practiced, slightly strained smile. "Dad, good to see you. You managed to get the barge running," he called out, his voice laced with that familiar, slightly patronizing concern. I straightened up, dusting the non-existent grime from my hands. I've always been meticulous about cleaning the barge, even if its vinyl seats smelled permanently of old coffee and good intentions. It's a fortress of practical obsolescence, a rolling testament to a time when cars were built to outlive their owners. "She's purring like a kitten, son. Just needed a little encouragement." Then Chloe emerged. She didn't walk. She flowed out of the SUV, clad in yoga wear that probably cost more than my monthly insurance premium. She took one look at the barge, then looked at me, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rising a millimeter. "Oh, Gary," she sighed, the sound both light and devastating. "You still haven't traded this relic in? Honestly, Mark worries about you. It looks like something out of a demolition derby waiting to happen." Mark shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly sensing the incoming domestic detonation. "Chloe, be nice. Dad loves this car." "Love doesn't keep you safe, darling," she countered, delicately stepping over a loose pebble as if it were an unexploded landmine. She glanced back at the trunk, then toward the open door of the house. "So, what exactly are you doing out here wrestling with that thing? Are you finally taking it to the scrapyard?" I let a slow, secretive smile spread across my face. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Chloe thrived on putting people in their place, especially people who didn't appreciate cutting-edge design or organic kale. She expected me to be hauling out rusty tools or maybe a bag of old newspapers. "Not quite, Chloe," I said, gripping the rusty trunk handle firmly. "I was just getting this loaded up. Got an early start on the weekend haul?" I gave the latch one final authoritative tug. It sprang open with a loud, metallic thwack that momentarily drowned out the distant sounds of suburbia. The old hinges groaned in protest, and the trunk lid swung up, revealing the interior. Chloe leaned in, readying another quip about the faded carpet liner, but the words died in her throat. Mark took an involuntary step back. It wasn't tools. It wasn't junk. The entire cavernous space, stretching from the bumper to the back seat, was completely filled. Not with boxes, not with luggage. It was packed tight with something dull, heavy, and utterly unexpected. Something that didn't belong in my quiet little driveway, or frankly, anywhere near Chloe's pristine vision of the world. I leaned against the fender, enjoying the sudden, absolute silence. "Like I said, Chloe, just finishing up the weekend haul." She blinked twice, her composure finally cracking. "What? What is that?" she whispered, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the contents. Are those antique diving weights?" I shook my head, the sun glinting off the smooth, dark surface of the top layer. Close, but much older and a lot less buoyant. Then, very deliberately, I reached in and pulled the top object free. It was heavy, easily 40 pounds, encased in thick, slightly muddy canvas tied with heavy-gauge rope. As I turned it slightly in the fading light, a small brass plaque attached to the canvas glinted briefly. It wasn't a weight or a tool. It was unmistakable, even under the grime. It was a crate, sealed tight, bearing the faded but legible stenciling of the Royal Navy, dated 1942. And from the small gap where the canvas had frayed near the corner, something dark, metallic, and distinctly curved was just visible. Chloe's eyes widened, suddenly losing all focus on her phone. Mark, however, looked like he'd just seen a ghost materialize beside the Mercedes. "Dad," Mark managed, his voice tight, "where did you get that?" I just smiled wider, setting the heavy package gently on the asphalt. "Oh, this old thing. I found it tucked away in the back of the boathouse storage unit I bought last month. The listing said assorted naval surplus." I didn't realize how assorted they meant. I turned back to the trunk, plunging my hand deep into the dark interior again. I pulled out a second crate, identical to the first. As I wrestled it free, the heavy object inside shifted with a dull, familiar clunk. "There's a lot more where that came from, Mark. Enough to fill the barge 3 times over. But this next one," I said, struggling slightly with the weight. "This one is much more interesting." I finally managed to heave the second crate onto the driveway beside the first. The canvas on this one had partially disintegrated. The wood underneath was warped, and I could see what was causing the shift. It wasn't just metal. It was a distinct heavy curve of polished wood and tarnished silver. As I nudged the crumbling wood away with my foot, the unmistakable outline of a highly ornate, long-barreled rifle glinted dully in the shade of the trunk. Chloe gasped again, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over her own designer sandals. "Gary, those look incredibly valuable. You need to call an auction house immediately." I chuckled, reaching back into the trunk for the third item. This one was smaller, wrapped in oilcloth, and when I pulled it out, it felt strangely light, almost hollow. I tossed the bundle onto the hood of the Mercedes, where it landed with a soft, unsettling thud. "Auction houses are for amateurs, Chloe," I replied, looking from the rifle to the small oilcloth bundle. "I like to know what I'm dealing with first." I peeled back the brittle, yellowed oilcloth covering the third item. It wasn't wood or metal. It was leather, dark brown and intricately tooled, wrapped around something long and cylindrical. The leather was cold to the touch, almost clammy. I pulled the knot loose and the cloth fell away, revealing not a weapon, but a case. A leather case that clearly wasn't designed for transport but for presentation. As I carefully unlatched the silver clasps, the air around us seemed to grow strangely still. Mark stopped breathing. Chloe leaned forward, mesmerized despite herself. The case sprang open. Inside, nestled against faded velvet lining, wasn't a jewel or a medal or even a document. It was a navigational sextant, an antique piece of brass engineering, beautiful and seemingly priceless. But beneath the sextant, lying flat against the velvet, was a thick, crisp envelope, stamped with a seal I recognized instantly from old history books, a seal that meant international trouble, decades overdue. I picked up the envelope, noticing the faint, dried crimson stain near the wax seal. "So, you see, Mark, Chloe," I said, holding the envelope up, "this isn't just naval surplus. This is the recovery. And what I'm about to read inside this letter is going to explain a whole lot about why my father suddenly disappeared off the coast of Corsica in 1944. I slid my thumb under the seal, breaking it with a sharp snap. Chloe leaned in so close I could smell her expensive, confusing perfume. I carefully unfolded the brittle paper inside, my eyes scanning the elegantly looping script written in fading sepia ink. The first line was clear, unmistakable, and utterly chilling. To whomever finds this cache, know that the treasure is not the brass, nor the wood, nor the silver, but the silence we bought with it. If you open this, the obligation passes to you, and the men who are still looking for this package will be looking for you by sunrise. My heart, which I generally considered to be a slow-moving, reliable machine fueled by strong coffee and stubbornness, suddenly kicked into an entirely inappropriate gear. Mark's face, usually so composed in his quarterly performance reviews, had gone the color of old milk. Chloe, however, was momentarily stunned into an almost admirable stillness. Her attention locked onto the letter in my hands as if it were a ticking clock. "Obligation," Mark croaked out, his voice losing its polished edge. "Dad, what obligation? What are you talking about? This is just some old family drama getting dredged up." I ignored him, my eyes fixed on the next few lines of the letter. The handwriting was shaky, indicating haste or duress, yet the language was precise, almost military. It spoke of the consignment and Operation Nightingale, terms that sounded ripped straight from a poorly researched spy thriller, except for the very real weight of the brass sextant resting on the hood of the Mercedes. "It's not drama, Mark," I murmured, lifting the rifle case, the one with the beautiful, terrifying curved wood, off the ground. It felt heavy, substantial, and distinctly unlike anything that should be found in a suburban storage unit. "It seems my father wasn't just a Navy radio operator stationed in Italy, as the official story goes." Chloe finally snapped out of her trance, a flicker of avarice mixed with genuine alarm crossing her features. "If this is anything illegal, Gary, you need to call a lawyer now. Mark, tell him to put everything back in the car and forget he saw it." "Too late for forgetting, I'm afraid," I said, placing the rifle case gently on the lawn. I traced the edge of the aged wax seal on the envelope with my thumb. "Listen to this. This is signed by Commander A. Volkov. He writes, 'The location of the real prize is detailed in the ledger found beneath the sextant. It is a ledger detailing the transfer of assets, not just military hardware, but something far more sensitive. This ledger must be delivered to Geneva by the final full moon, or the truth of the Volkov Pact will surface.'" I looked up at my son, feeling a strange, cold surge of adrenaline. "The Volkov Pact, Mark. Remember that obscure footnote in your international relations degree? The one about the secret post-war German technology exchange the Allies allegedly covered up?" Mark swallowed hard. "It's conspiracy theory, Dad, fringe nonsense." "Fringe nonsense usually doesn't come wrapped up with 002 weaponry and threats delivered decades later," I countered. I returned to the open trunk, carefully lifting the sextant out of its velvet bed. The lining beneath it was thick, slightly padded. I pressed down, feeling a give. With a small click, a false bottom sprung open, revealing a slim, leather-bound book no larger than a modern tablet. This had to be the ledger. As I pulled the ledger out, something fell from the recess where it had been hidden. Something metallic that skittered across the pavement toward the shadow of the house. It wasn't another piece of ordnance. It was a small, heavy cylinder, dull gray, about the size of a flashlight, with a single recessed red button on one end. Before any of us could move, before Mark could tell me to stop touching things, the cylinder began to emit a faint, high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate more in my bones than in my ears. The sound was thin, escalating rapidly, like an insect trapped in a glass jar about to shatter. Chloe shrieked, leaping away from the Mercedes as if it had spontaneously combusted. "What is that noise? Get rid of it!" "I don't think I can," I yelled over the rising frequency. The noise was becoming physically painful. I tried to grab the cylinder, intending to hurl it into the street, but as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the whine abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was absolute, heavy, and unnatural. The birds in the oak trees had stopped singing. Even the faint hum of traffic from the main road seemed to have vanished. And then I saw it. Reflected in the polished brass of the sextant lying on the hood of the Mercedes, I caught a movement at the end of the driveway, a movement that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a car. It was a man, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the manicured lawn, shrouded almost perfectly by the deep shadows cast by the setting sun. He wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light, and he was looking directly at the open trunk of the barge, his silhouette tall and unnervingly still. He wasn't peering. He was observing, and in his right hand, held loosely at his side, was something long, sleek, and unmistakably modern, a suppressor-equipped automatic rifle. I hadn't heard an engine. I hadn't heard footsteps. He was simply there. "Mark, Chloe," I hissed, dropping the ledger and frantically sweeping the rifle case and the sextant toward the relative safety of the open car door. "Get inside, now!" Mark finally moved, grabbing Chloe's arm and yanking her toward the front door. They scrambled up the porch steps, fumbling with the deadbolt. I grabbed the last, heaviest piece, the crate labeled 1942, and heaved it onto the trunk floor just as the man in the shadows took his first deliberate step onto my property. The faint crunch of gravel under his polished boot sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. I slammed the heavy trunk lid down. The sound of the latch catching felt painfully inadequate. I turned to follow my son and daughter-in-law inside, but before I could even reach the porch steps, the man raised his weapon, sighting down the barrel not at the trunk, but directly at the front door Mark was currently trying to secure. The sound of the rifle bolt cycling was terrifyingly loud in the unnatural quiet that had descended upon the neighborhood. It was a sharp mechanical assertion of intent that shattered the illusion of suburban safety I had carefully cultivated for 30 years. "Mark, get down!" I roared, lunging toward the porch steps, forgetting entirely the keys to the house were in my pocket, not in the lock. Mark, bless his panicked modern soul, reacted instantly, not by diving for cover, but by instinctively pulling Chloe down behind the thick stucco pillar flanking the doorway. The rifle in the stranger's hands didn't even waver. He wasn't aiming for the pillar, he was aiming for the exact center mass of the door, the presumed location of the largest target. Bang! The sound was a deafening, explosive concussion that made the windows rattle in their frames. Instead of splintering wood, however, there was only a dull, heavy thud, the sound of a high-velocity round impacting something incredibly dense. The front door didn't shatter. It barely shuddered. I skidded to a halt halfway across the lawn, staring. The stranger frowned, clearly surprised by the door's unexpected resilience. He chambered another round, the metallic click resonating with grim finality. "Dad, the car!" Chloe screamed from behind the pillar, her voice strained with genuine terror. "Get in the barge and drive." Drive where? To the next town over? This man had materialized out of thin air, silenced the wildlife, and seemed equipped to handle the combined defenses of the U.S. military. Yet there was the barge, my rusty, reliable fortress, sitting right there. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted to the driver's side door of the Oldsmobile, yanked the handle. It always stuck a little, and vaulted into the vinyl seat. The interior smelled overwhelmingly of mothballs and stale possibilities. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hand slick with nervous sweat. The stranger seemed to realize I was attempting an escape. He shifted his aim slightly, adjusting his position to account for the angle of the vehicle. I cranked the key. The engine caught instantly, roaring to life with a magnificent sputtering cough that sounded more like a declaration of war than a starting sequence. The barge, bless its outdated V8 heart, responded with guttural enthusiasm. Bang! Bang! 2 more shots rang out. The first struck the rear quarter panel of the Mercedes SUV, punching through the thick protective coating with a sickening crunch of metal that sent a spray of black paint dust into the air. The second one, the one that mattered, hit the thick steel of the barge's trunk, right near the hinge where I had just slammed the World War II relics inside. I felt the impact through the chassis, a solid, jarring thump that confirmed the round had been stopped, but the force was considerable. I slammed the gear selector into drive, stomped the gas pedal, and the barge, groaning in protest but obeying the command, lurched forward. The tires spun momentarily on the asphalt before finding purchase. I glanced in the rearview mirror, ignoring the throbbing pain in my ear from the close-range shots. The stranger was moving now, abandoning his static position, stepping into the open yard, abandoning cover. He was closing the distance with an unnerving, smooth jog, still aiming. "Hold on, Mark!" "Chloe!" I yelled, though I knew they were already locked down inside. The engine was screaming now, the old transmission complaining bitterly as I pushed the speedometer past 40 in a 25 zone. I wrenched the steering wheel hard to the left, aiming to swing the barge out onto the street and put distance between us and the silent assassin. As I completed the turn, I looked down at the dashboard, the ancient, rattling dashboard. That's when I saw it. It wasn't the low fuel light or the temperature gauge spiking dangerously high. It was the small, square plastic panel above the radio that housed the AM/FM settings. The panel was vibrating violently, not from the engine's rattle, but from something being pressed against the back of the dash from the inside. I had been so focused on the shooter outside that I'd forgotten about the second layer of debris I'd tossed into the car while wrestling the artifacts out of the trunk. I'd shoved the oilcloth-wrapped item, the leather case containing the sextant's accomplice, onto the back seat, thinking I'd secure it later. But it wasn't on the back seat anymore. As the car cornered sharply, the leather case had slid forward, lodging itself against the back of the dashboard. And the high-velocity impact the trunk had taken just moments before must have dislodged whatever was inside the case, causing it to shift and somehow activate whatever mechanism had been waiting in that leather pouch. The vibrating object began to emit a thin, rhythmic beep, beep, beep. It was a timer. A digital timer, glowing an angry fluorescent red through a tear in the leather. It was counting down from 10 seconds. And the sheer violence of the impact had apparently cracked the seal on the World War II era equipment, creating a very modern, very deadly fuse. I had just fled a professional killer, only to discover I was currently driving a 20-year-old car rigged with an explosive device that was rapidly approaching zero. I slammed on the brakes, tires squealing in protest, throwing Mark and Chloe forward against the door frames inside. The barge shuddered to a halt directly in the middle of the intersection. Get out! Get out now!" I shrieked, throwing the door open as the counter flashed. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 3 seconds. The smell of burning rubber mingled immediately with the sickly, sweet, high-pitched whine that had briefly paralyzed us moments before. This time, the sound was definitely emanating from the dashboard, emanating from the leather case, wedged against the ignition console. The digital counter on the tiny device glowed a malevolent red. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 2 seconds. Panic is a great leveler. It stripped away Chloe's carefully constructed veneer of superiority instantly. She didn't wait for Mark. She scrambled out of the passenger door on her side like a startled gazelle, tearing out into the empty intersection. Mark followed her instantly, stumbling as he hit the asphalt. I was half out of the driver's side, my body contorted awkwardly over the steering wheel, my hand reaching for the emergency brake lever to prevent the barge from rolling into the crosswalk. 00:00:01. "Dad, leave the keys!" Mark screamed, pulling Chloe toward the neighbor's hedge. Leave the keys? Leave the vehicle containing a suspected active bomb, 2 priceless historical artifacts, and a potentially incriminating ledger? Absolutely not. I ripped the keys from the ignition, slammed the door shut, and threw myself toward the curb, diving headfirst behind a large decorative retaining wall just as the counter hit 00:00:00. The resulting detonation was not the earth-shattering roar I had envisioned for a device capable of surviving decades in a sealed trunk. It was a focused, concussive thump, sharp, immediate, and intensely hot. It sounded less like C4 and more like a massive, poorly sealed pressure cooker exploding. A wave of heat washed over me, followed by the thick, pungent odor of scorched vinyl and melting plastic. For a terrifying second, the world went silent again, replaced only by the high-pitched ringing in my ears. I risked a peek over the retaining wall. The barge was still there. Mostly. The hood was buckled upwards like a popped sardine can lid. The front windshield was completely gone, and the driver's side door was hanging open at an impossible angle, having been blown entirely off its hinges. Black smoke billowed from the engine bay, thick and oily. The interior was a ruin of molten plastic and shredded upholstery, but the trunk, miraculously, looked relatively intact. The heavy-duty hinges and the sheer density of the cargo inside, the World War II crates, seemed to have absorbed the worst of the blast, channeling the force upward and forward. And where was the assassin? I scanned the street. The man with the rifle was gone. He hadn't been anywhere near the immediate blast radius, which meant he had either retreated the moment he saw the timer activate, or he'd anticipated the explosion and was already repositioning. "Dad, are you okay?" Mark yelled from behind the neighbor's privet, sounding panicked but whole. "Fine, just singed," I shouted back, scrambling to my feet. I staggered toward the wrecked driver's side door. The rifle case and the sextant were gone, blown clear by the internal pressure or incinerated. Only the heavy ledger, which I had tossed onto the lawn near the initial landing spot, remained recognizable, lying open near the retaining wall, slightly singed around the edges. I snatched the ledger. It was warm, but whole. As I turned toward the relative safety of the porch, I saw Chloe doing something unexpected. Instead of staying low, she was standing near the ruined Mercedes, staring intently at its side panel where the first bullet had struck. "Chloe, get away from there. The shooter could be coming back," I yelled, sprinting toward her. She didn't look up. "Mark, look," she breathed, her voice hushed with a strange, almost scientific fascination. She pointed at the ragged hole the bullet had torn through the Mercedes' armored skin. "It stopped. Gary's car explosion. It made him stop shooting at us." "He's not stopping. He's relocating," I insisted, reaching her side. As I grabbed her arm to pull her toward the house, I finally saw what she was looking at. The bullet that had struck the Mercedes hadn't just ripped through the paint. It had deflected off something behind the exterior paneling. The bullet had been stopped cold by a thin metallic plate installed just inside the doorframe. It was unmistakably high-grade titanium alloy, professionally fitted, a makeshift armor plate installed with surgical precision. Mark finally joined us, his eyes wide as he took in the smoking husk of the barge and the bullet-pitted Mercedes. Why would he shoot at the car? If he wanted us, why didn't he just shoot us when we were standing on the porch? I looked from the impenetrable front door to the heavily reinforced Mercedes, then back at the demolished Oldsmobile. Because he wasn't aiming for us when he shot the cars, I explained, my voice catching in my throat. I looked down at the open ledger in my hand, then back at the silent, empty street, where the sun had now completely vanished, plunging the neighborhood into premature twilight. He was aiming to destroy the evidence in the vehicle that hadn't exploded yet. I tapped the ledger meaningfully. He wasn't trying to kill us immediately. He was trying to eliminate the package. He knew the barge was carrying the explosive trigger, but he didn't know about the ledger, the sextant, or whatever the rifle was for. As that horrifying realization settled, the silence of the street broke. It wasn't the crisp, mechanical sound of the assassin's rifle this time. It was a sound far more pervasive, far more alarming. The distant yet rapidly approaching whoop of police sirens. "The timer," Mark whispered, his face paling further. The explosion must have triggered the silent alarm, or maybe the neighbors finally noticed the gunfire. "Doesn't matter," I snapped, gripping the ledger tighter. "The police will find the barge. They'll find the scorch marks, and they'll find this book, the one that details a 50-year-old conspiracy involving German scientists and captured Allied gold." I looked desperately up and down the quiet, darkened street. There was nowhere to hide the evidence, and no time to explain to the responding officers that the evidence was part of a highly sensitive international recovery operation initiated by my long-dead father. Then, through the gathering gloom, a new sound cut through the rising sirens. A low, powerful, unmistakable sound of heavy machinery moving fast. It wasn't a police car. It was the deep, resonant thrum of a helicopter approaching from the west, too low for standard air traffic, and clearly bearing down on my location. And just as the first police cruiser rounded the corner, lights flashing wildly, the massive shadow of the approaching aircraft fell across the lawn, and I could clearly see the insignia painted on its underbelly. Not police markings, not military, but a clean, stylized silver eagle, the exact emblem embossed on the wax seal of Commander Volkov's letter. The roar of the approaching helicopter was immediate and overwhelming, instantly drowning out the tentative wail of the arriving police cruiser. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol car, which moments ago had represented salvation, now felt like spotlights illuminating a trap. I looked at Mark and Chloe, both frozen between the safety of the porch and the undeniable danger closing in from above. The man with the rifle, the operative, was clearly not alone. This was not a simple retrieval. This was a coordinated extraction of sensitive material, and the explosion in the barge was only a diversion meant to clear the immediate vicinity. "The ledger goes with me," I barked, tucking the singed leather book deep inside the waistband of my trousers, just above the belt line. "Mark, Chloe, tell the police nothing about the trunk. Tell them you heard gunshots and saw a man flee toward the woods." "Dad, you can't be serious," Mark protested, gesturing wildly toward the smoking wreck of the Oldsmobile. "They're going to ask about the explosion. They're going to ask about a vehicular malfunction caused by old wiring," I shot back, my voice surprisingly steady. "They are not going to ask about the Volkov Pact, not yet." The helicopter descended rapidly, the downdraft hitting the street like a physical blow, scattering leaves, loose debris, and the ruined remains of the Oldsmobile's hood across the lawn. The noise was so intense that conversation was impossible. We were communicating purely through frantic gestures and wide, terrified eyes. The helicopter, a sleek black military-grade model, stabilized about 50 feet above the street, hovering directly over the intersection. A thick, braided rope ladder tumbled down, swaying violently in the turbulence. From the open door hatch, a figure leaned out. Not the man with the rifle, but someone in a dark flight suit, illuminated by the harsh floodlight fixed to the undercarriage. He pointed directly at me. The local police officer, clearly out of his depth, stumbled backward toward his cruiser, reaching for his radio, probably calling for backup against a threat he couldn't even comprehend. This was it. My father had left me a legacy, not of money, but of dangerous secrets, and now the inheritors had arrived to collect. I didn't run toward the house. I didn't run toward the police. I turned and sprinted directly toward the dangling rope ladder. Mark shouted something, but the wind tore the sound away. I reached the ladder, grabbed the lowest rung, and began to climb with surprising agility, fueled by a lifetime of repressed restlessness. The metal was cold and slick against my sweaty hands. The noise was deafening. It felt like being inside a trapped storm. As I ascended, I saw the man with the rifle emerge from the shadows near the adjacent property. He raised his weapon again, steadying it against the sudden wind shear, aiming for my back. But as he sighted down the barrel, the helicopter pilot seemed to acknowledge his presence. A single sharp burst of directed sound, not gunfire, but an acoustic pulse that seemed to push the air itself, hit the gunman. He staggered violently, clutching his helmeted head, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air above the neighbor's roof. I reached the hatch, hauling myself over the lip of the door frame, tumbling onto the metal floor inside. The pilot, a professional with a tight, impersonal expression, slammed the hatch shut without a word, cutting off the roar of the street below. The interior of the cabin was cramped and illuminated by instrument panels glowing an eerie green. Beside the pilot sat an older gentleman, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that somehow survived the flight conditions, reading glasses perched precisely on his nose. He looked like a diplomat who moonlighted as a syndicate boss. He slowly lowered the thick, aged ledger I had provided, the one I'd salvaged from the wreckage. He didn't even glance at the charred remains of the barge, visible through the small porthole window. His focus was entirely on the historical text. He looked up at me, his expression one of detached approval. "Gary Albright," he stated, his voice calm and resonant, barely audible above the persistent thrum of the rotors now climbing steeply into the night sky. "Your father was an honorable man. He trusted us to retrieve this when the time was right, should he fail to return." He carefully turned a brittle page of the ledger. The Volkov Pact details the location of several highly sensitive German chemical prototypes, not gold. The people looking for this didn't want the weapons. They wanted the silence those weapons guaranteed. He tapped the page with a manicured finger. "You have delivered the ledger and proven your capacity to survive contact. The retrieval is complete." He folded the book neatly and passed it to the pilot. "Deliver this to Sector 7 immediately." He then turned back to me, leaning forward conspiratorially. "As for your inheritance, Mr. Albright, it is extensive but conditional." I braced myself for demands, for servitude, for a life lived in shadows. "What are the conditions?" He smiled, a thin, satisfied curve of the lips. "The conditions are simple. You have proven you can maintain a secure vehicle for decades and that you can survive an encounter with a well-equipped retrieval team. You are now free. The obligation is dissolved. You have nothing left to fear." He gestured toward the open hatch, now visible as we climbed high above the suburban sprawl, the flashing blue lights of the police cars receding to pinpricks. "However," he continued, his eyes twinkling faintly in the green cabin light, "we are going to need you to replace your current mode of transportation. That Oldsmobile was a liability. I've had my team secure a replacement for you." He snapped his fingers. The pilot pressed a button. Suddenly, the overhead light in the cabin shifted from green to a bright, luxurious amber. And there, parked neatly on the floor beneath the observation window, sat a brand new, matte black, top-of-the-line Mercedes SUV, identical in every spec to the one Chloe had arrived in. Only this one had a full tank of gas, a fresh coat of wax, and no signs of bullet damage. "Welcome to the next chapter, Mr. Albright," the man concluded smoothly. "Now, would you like to fly commercial, or shall we take the private jet to Geneva?